You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the DIXIE Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of DIXIE Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
That was the National Russian Children's Choir singing in honor of our guest, Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. Dr. Johnson, some of you may remember from last year, is an expert, probably on all things Russian, perhaps the foremost expert on Russia here, and so a regular writer for and on the board of editors for TBR Magazine. And it's our honor to have him on the show today. In fact, Dr. Johnson was probably our best rated guest of last year. I looked back over the ratings from last year, and the show that we had Dr. Johnson on as our guest had 5 times more listeners than any other broadcast of the year. And if you go to the archives and you thousands more viewers than the other programs did. So Dr. Johnson was probably our most popular guest here on TBR Radio Presents the DIXIE Heritage Hour in 2018. And hopefully he will be again here in 2019. He is the author of a recently published book, The Soviet Experiment, which has been published by TBR Press. Dr. Johnson, welcome to the show today.
Edward, it's nice to be on again. Thank you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book? I understand that there's a lot of detail in that book, having just spoken with Paul Angel, who was the editor of the publishing company, that there was a lot of detail to the book. So why don't you tell us about it?
For the last 25 years, Russian and Soviet studies has been my primary focus as a historian. And a lot of these, I've taught all over the country, universities all over the country. I've been fired from every one, I'm proud to say. Extremely popular with students, unpopular with professors. And a lot of lectures and things have gelled together in my mind to create this. Really, it's a set of essays. This is a long time in coming. These have been published, although not in this form, in various places. They've been rewritten. All the translations are mine, with a few exceptions. A lot of the stuff that hasn't been translated before.
Paul had said that a lot of the source material in your book was translated from Russian, and it was documents and sources that historians and researchers here in the United States would probably never even have access to.
Well, he's right about that, especially some of the Orthodox stuff. The white exiles came to this country and brought a lot with them, and I have access to some of that. My book on Serbia comes from a manuscript that I found at Fairleigh Dickinson University Library by accident from a member of the royal family, and that whole thing turned into a book. I taught myself Russian about 18 years ago. I'm slow, but I'm accurate. I'm adequate for what I need. So using primary source materials is absolutely essential here. The key thesis, there's a few of them, because this deals with literature, this deals with economics and ideology mostly. But one of the key theses here is that Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky were identical in ideology and in tactics. They differed only when they needed to bash the other for some reason. So when Trotsky went into exile, all of a sudden the things that he was advocating 10 years earlier became terrible. They were not different. They all believed in terrorism. They all believed in killing Christians. They all believed in killing civilians. They all believed in completely state-run economy, which is a party-run economy. These were all very wealthy men, which is something that I don't think anyone has mentioned before outside of the exile community. The biggest problem with the white exiles after the Russian Civil War is that none of them learned English.
And when you say white exiles, you're not talking about ethnically white or racially white. You're talking about white versus red politically.
That's right. Yeah, the Russian Civil War, the white versus the red armies. And everyone coming out of Russia was white ethnically, although of course the communist movement was not. These were Asiatic Khazars. Speaking of which, the thesis that Stalin was anti-Jewish is ridiculous. I have 1,000 quotes from him condemning anti-Semitism. It was a capital crime under his rule. He married 2 of them. He knew Yiddish. He surrounded himself with Jews. The key issue there, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only one saying this, when he purged the party of his perceived opponents, since the early Bolsheviks were almost all Jews at the elite levels, it looked like, if you didn't know any better, that he just didn't like Jews. But if you're going to purge the old Bolsheviks, well, you have no choice. You're very few Gentiles at the elite level. So if you're an American historian, liberal historian, or a Jew in the Western world, you kind of have a problem. Either you admit that Bolshevism was Jewish, which they're not going to do, or they create this myth that Stalin was this Russian nationalist and anti-Semite. And that's another big part of the book as well. That all of them were identical in their views of the Jews, and that anti-Semitism was the mark of the Black Hundreds, and the czarist clergy and everything else they needed to be destroyed. Stalin's works aren't secret. They have all been translated, and he was very, very clear what he thought about that kind of thing. So it's a myth that I wanted to put to rest. The idea that Stalin was a nationalist. There's a lot of Russians who I admire, guys like Oleg Platonov, who are great on so many issues, are convinced that Stalin was a nationalist. And he even advocated, as I mentioned in the book, a universal language, a melding of all the languages of the world. He had a whole agenda based on this. Again, his works are available in English. There's a lot of them, and no one feels like reading them. But of course, I also translate a lot of new things, things that people, like Paul says, I really no one would ever think about. Russia scholars in America are very few. They're conformist, essentially Menshevik in their general point of view. They're vaguely sympathetic to Bolshevism. They realize today that that's not really tenable. But don't forget, and I think I said this the last time I was on the show, there was an entire Holocaust revisionist movement in American academia in the 1970s saying that Stalin didn't kill all these people, and that's Ukrainian nationalist propaganda or whatever it is. Anti-Semitic, of course, was always the term they used. And this was identical to your Holocaust revisionists concerning Hitler, except because it concerned the Soviet Union, it was not only okay, but subsidized. Now, that movement has died down today, especially since the 1990s, all the documents came to light. You can't deny it anymore. This is one very well-documented genocide. But there was an entire movement in academia dedicated to Holocaust revisionism concerning the USSR, and people forget about that.
What was your inspiration to write this book? Because you've written other books on Russia. What caused you to want to write this one?
I noticed that some of the essays that I had published had a theme. I noticed that I found myself making the same argument, although in very, very different form. Another one of the main pillars of the book is that labor, workers, were the very last thing that Soviet party members ever cared about. None of these people were working class. Most of the Jews were upper middle class from the merchant families from Odessa and parts of Ukraine. A lot of them were from Poland or from Brooklyn. They had no conception of what the workers' life was like. They really didn't like them very much. Trotsky was pretty clear there, let alone the peasantry, which Trotsky hated. And this is supposed to be the worker and peasants' government. You notice when you read the stuff in the original Pravda articles and all the propaganda that they use a word like proletarian or worker or labor to mean something very different than what we mean. We think of worker, we think of a guy in a factory. We think of a guy who works for a boss, something like that. No, they meant supporters of the party. I quote where Trotsky said that Jacob Schiff was a proletarian. Billionaire banker of the day was a proletarian. But a impoverished priest in Ukraine was a kulak member of the elite. So clearly he's not using these words in the way that we would use these words. And for 100 years, these have been taken for granted, that they must mean what they say. But in no country was labor exploited with the viciousness as it was in the early industrialization of the USSR. And that's something that people forget about. When you have a state-run economy, that means the state owns everything, which is another way of saying the party owns everything. So when Trotsky was murdered, he had 2 bank accounts. And I had to do a lot of research to get my hands on some of this, but he was even at the time was a billionaire. He had 2 huge bank accounts, one in New York and one in Geneva, that made him a billionaire. He was one of the richest men in the world, which would make sense if you control an entire economy. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was nothing more than a transmission belt to take the labor, the Russian population, capital that they were getting from the West, and enriching themselves. And that's really what it comes down to.
Well, isn't that the same thing that's basically happened in Venezuela?
Well, that's the case in any ruling class, unfortunately. Chavez was a military man. He was a national socialist in terms of ideology. Of course, he would never put it that way. That's very typical of the Third World. Under his rule, there was tremendous economic growth, and tremendous growth not only in tax collection to the state, but wages and salaries. He was extremely popular. One of the things he did, of course, was break the back of the old landed oligarchy, giving mountains of land to peasants to farm themselves rather than being renters. Hafez al-Assad did the same thing in Syria. Saddam Hussein did the same thing in Iraq. The military government in Burma did the same thing. This is in the Third World what's been very successful in terms of economic development. And of course, so much was paid for with oil. No doubt that there was a lot of people. But under Chavez, now afterwards is another story, but under Chavez, the economy boomed in every respect. And not just quantitatively, but qualitatively too. But when you have a dependency on the United States, because Venezuela is completely dependent on the U.S. as its number one trading partner by far, and that gets cut off, you're going to be in a lot of trouble when your assets are frozen, when you have every possible economic weapon used against you, not only from the U.S., but from the European Union. This is what's going to happen. And I think Maduro remains popular because Chavez was popular. And he was popular because he delivered the goods. As a typical military man in Latin America, he was vehemently anti-communist. The Communist Party always hated him. It was, I believe it was, for the most part, illegal under Chavez. And there's a big difference between National Socialism or some kind of social nationalism in one way or another than actual Leninism. That was not only condemned by Chavez, but proscribed by him. Maduro is kind of riding on his coattails, but he has the unenviable position of dealing with sanctions that would cripple any country. The U.S. can't do that with Russia or Belarus or China. Not only are they too big, but they're not as dependent on the American market as Venezuela is, or Iran for that matter. Sanctions on Iran are meaningless. But when a country that's that dependent, sanctions can destroy people. So we're talking about apples and oranges here, I think.
A little bit of an education there, not only for myself, but for our listeners as well. You talk about sanctions and crippling a country. North Korea, of course, is a country that's been crippled by sanctions for however many years. One thing that's not even making the news in this country, but I'm sure you've studied it just as you've studying all things regarding Russia. Kim Jong-un recently had a summit with Vladimir Putin. And what is the significance of that as far as the United States isn't allowing Trump to make a deal with North Korea? My personal belief is that if nothing else, the Korean War would have come to an end at the Vietnam summit had John Bolton and very possibly even Mike Pompeo and who knows who else was in the American delegation hadn't basically told Trump no deal. So now Kim Jong-un is going to Vladivostok and he's having conversations with Vladimir Putin. How does the whole dynamic of all this change now that the conversation is with Russia and not with Washington?
Well, remember, the Vladivostok summit was almost entirely economic. The first thing that he needed was food assistance. Flour he asked for specifically, but not only that, but the ability to have regular back and forth with agricultural goods with Russia. And then there was two other issues, the oil pipeline and the natural gas pipeline. There was a natural gas pipeline that they had been discussing even in the Cold War that never quite got done. The pipeline actually goes through China rather than directly to North Korea. People forget that despite what happened in the Korean War, North Korea was a Soviet client state, not a Chinese client state. North Korea shares a little bit of a border with Russia, just a tiny little speck in the far north. And of course, the completion of a railway line, which was never done. Trade with China, North Korea, I guess, is okay, but he realizes that trade with Russia, especially given the things that he needs, the heavy industry, the basic stuff of an economy, comes from a man that he perceives, of course, is not under the control of international capital. What Putin said, we don't know. That hasn't been released yet. But there's certainly plenty of Russian, especially in government, that want to complete this. They need to see that, of course, North Korea is stable, that the U.S. isn't going to nuke it anytime soon, shoring up the allies where he can get them. So it's food assistance and then energy. And I'm not so sure he's attempting to play China and Russia off against each other, which is hard to do because North Korea isn't really a big strategic asset. There is, however, a lot of rare metals in North Korea.
See, that's what I was going to ask you, because obviously I know what Kim has to offer to the Americans, particularly to Trump, and that is some type of a legacy. That is Trump being able to say that as the master negotiator, he struck the deal that none of his predecessors could strike. But what does Kim have to give to the Russians? In other words, why should the Russians give anything to the North Koreans and not get something in return? And so obviously, what is the incentive then that Kim can put out there for the Russians?
In the South Korean case, you have an ethnically homogenous people with a high IQ, very hardworking, In the right environment, they're going to create a first world economy, like South Korea did under General Park. Under authoritarianism and a kind of a national syndicalism is what South Korea used. I have a whole set of papers on when the U.S. actually tilted to North Korea in the 60s because General Park gave his admiration for Hitler and Napoleon and everything else. Chung-hee Park was the father of South Korea. People don't realize that one of the reasons that there's still troops in Korea, despite the fact that South Korea is a first world powerhouse, is General Park said, if you pull the troops out, I'm going to build my own nuclear weapons. For whatever reason, the U.S. didn't like that idea, so the troops are there. It's a long story having to do with the Pueblo incident and everything else. So you have tremendous potential here under the right leadership. Without these sanctions, without the global microscope on North Korea, what they're capable of, it could be extraordinary. Being on the ground floor of that may be in the interests of both the Chinese and the Russians, but they're both under tremendous pressure to maintain sanctions on this guy. You can't enforce sanctions on countries that big and that powerful and that are not dependent on the United States. Other than rare metals, a tremendous amount of potential, an educated, literate population, a militarized population, an anti-Western population. You have to think long term. And I don't know if Putin is thinking long term, but there's a lot of potential there. There's a market, there's rare metals, bauxite for aluminum in particular. There's not a whole lot of countries that make that or that possess that. Up in the mountains, they've only just begun to explore it for this stuff. There's tons of stuff up there that we don't even know exists. So there's most certainly an interest in it. It's just right now, it's just a lot of wasted potential. But the Chinese could do it. The Taiwanese can do it. Definitely North Korea can do it. We just know so little about the system. What we know about the day-to-day life of the system comes from these defectors, and I don't trust them. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the North Korean defectors who are female are always very good looking. That can't be a coincidence. Their stories are always changing. Some of them are just stupid. I mean, they get paid relative to the importance of the information that they get. And they don't have an easy life with it. So they have every incentive to extrapolate, to augment their stories. I'm not saying it's all lies, but that's pretty much all we know.
There are some things that I just have to say, to my mind, they sound ludicrous. For example, there is a city on the border of North and South Korea just beyond the demilitarized zone. I do not remember the name of the city. According to media sources in our country, it's really a skeleton of a city or a shell of a city, and the North Koreans basically pay people to live there and pretend to be engaging in commerce and pretend to be going about the day-to-day, activity of life in a modern city, so that South Koreans with telescopes can look at these people through the telescopes and think that life in North Korea is normal. But in my mind, why should the North Koreans go to all that trouble? Wouldn't it be simpler for that just to be a city functioning normally?
They did. You must have seen that there was a documentary on that city. I also can't think of it. A lot of trade with China happens there. It's they tried to get Western journalists. One Western journalist did sneak in. I don't know how far he got. He was a Chinese American. And yeah, a lot of these things, atrocity stories all tend to be the same. With North Korea, how are you going to verify this? Johnson's Law, which is a law of social science that I discovered, named after myself. The more obscure the country, the more obscure the political system, the more that the media can lie about it and get away with it, or simply just be mistaken about it. And there's so few people who can tell you otherwise that why bother work? The narrative here matters more than the reality. One defector, that little very, very attractive woman whose story changes every time I hear her. One of her compatriots in one of the camps she was in said that Christians were tortured by pouring molten lead down their throats. Now, that story has been used. They did it for the Nazis and stuff. I've heard it before. I'm thinking to myself, this is ridiculous. Where do they have it? They have a foundry, a giant steel producing factory right there in the prison. You imagine the expense that you would have to get molten lead into a prison cell? It's ridiculous. It's laughable. She's the one who said that if you have a South Korean movie, you're shocked. I said, no, you're not. There's no way that any country could enforce that with any degree of severity. And so they exaggerate, they invent, and we really can't say anything about it. There's a huge PR campaign. I mean, I'm no apologist for North Korea.
Right, and neither am I. It's just some of the stories I'm hearing are so ludicrous. It's just they don't pass the sniff test.
Like the molten lead story. Can you imagine the expense of doing that? It's ridiculous, and you get shot for saying the wrong thing. You get shot for littering. I've heard all of this stuff. But when the atrocity stories just seem ridiculous, when they say that they shoot children, I say no, that doesn't happen. A normal man doesn't shoot a child. Period. He'd have to be on so many drugs or be bombing from the air to do that. But this is about tugging at our heartstring. They could say whatever the heck they want. And you have defectors who get paid for this kind of stuff and get paid a lot of money because the media loves this kind of story. The papers sell, and the media loves this stuff, and they create this whole narrative of this psychopath. And we simply don't know. We don't know how bad it is. We don't know how good it is. We hear about starvation, but the UN has never actually been there. The whole United Nations Human Rights Report, they never showed up. They were never in that country. They spoke to the same defectors that the New York Times did. It's, the sniff test, I know exactly what you mean, but when you have an American press that really doesn't have any foreign correspondents anymore, the few that they have aren't specialists in the area. None of these people speak the language. They go to the CIA for information. They go to the White House for information. The average age of a foreign correspondent now is 27. They're idiots. Most of their reporting is done from the Hawk and Dove in downtown D.C. And this is what you're getting, and this is why you're getting the same story, the same atrocity nonsense, whether it be North Korea, anti-homosexual camps in Chechnya. That was a thing I had to write about 2 years ago. Western China, the concentration camps there. But they could say whatever they want. How many people know what's going on in Xinjiang province? And this is what builds, not only does it suit the interests of the press, but it suits the interests of the CIA and the U.S. government, who, of course, is picking a fight with these very same people. And so Johnson's Law is something we always have to keep in mind. And I realize that, we have to focus, specialize in certain areas. We can get deep into this stuff. And some of the stuff that's coming in the press, the Times, the Post, allegedly, the paper of record is so cringy and nonsensical. And it comes from the fact that you don't really have a foreign correspondence corps anymore. So you're absolutely right to make fun of these people, and they deserve it.
Recently, I was in Cuba in March. One of the Cuban pastors that I was moving around Havana with, we were in a restaurant, and for whatever reason, he decided to let the restaurant know that I was a writer for the American Free Press and that I was an American journalist. All of a sudden, I had, dozens of people around me asking me questions and different things.
But was he hostile?
No. He was actually trying to draw a crowd for me to preach to them.
Oh, so he was excited. Oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah. And so we go into this restaurant, and he tells everybody that I'm an American journalist, that I'm a writer for the American Free Press. Of course, everybody in the restaurant now is, gathering around me. An old Cuban guy. He said, I can remember when American journalists used to come to Havana frequently. He said, but I haven't seen one in 30 years.
Yeah, and those that do come don't speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And, I did an entire lengthy paper on some of the military dictators in Latin America, Batista, one of them. Of course, almost to a man, these were nationalists, these were pro-labor, these were certainly pro-peasant, very much like the Chavez I explained to you a minute ago, all very similar policies and all condemned by the U.S. There's a myth out there that I've spent hours fighting, that the U.S. supported all of these anti-communist military dictatorships in Latin America, and it isn't true. Of course, I don't know what they mean by support. Support, I guess, for them is anything short of declaring war on them. But, Pinochet was barred from the country. I have CIA stuff that I've cited of the U.S. condemning these guys. You're too harsh on the communists. You have to be nice to them. The Soviets are upset, or the Cubans are upset. They believed all the atrocity stories from El Salvador. I did an entire broadcast on this Romero communist jerk who just got canonized by the Roman Pope. And it's the same thing. Story after story after story that's accepted without criticism because it fits a narrative. As far as Latin America goes, a guy like Batista, who, the economy exploded under that man. He was extremely pro-labor and pro-union, despite all the myths that developed later on. I'm telling you, everything that the average educated American thinks about the world is fantasy. It's absolute fantasy. And comments like you just mentioned about the guy, we don't see American journalists here anymore. Well, they don't need to be there. Their job is to sell papers. Their job is to tell a story. Their job is to support the leftist agenda. That's their purpose, not to tell the truth. They have no obligation to educate us, to give us facts. They have no obligation. They don't see themselves that way. And so to condemn them for not giving us facts is to say something they already know. It's uninteresting. That is not their job. That is not their sense of purpose. It's to tell a good story. And I've dedicated my life to this, which is a difficult, thankless life. Every day I uncover another myth, another ridiculous story that people, including me, believed for a long time. And it really doesn't take a whole lot to dig deeper into this. Why would a government do that? Why would they slaughter people for no reason? What is the point of this? Who benefits from any of this kind of stuff? And how little is actually examined, whether it be by academics, politicians, or journalists. I'll say it again. Everything that the average educated American believes about the world is fantasy.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines.
I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Well, one of the stories that is proliferating right now is that whole Russian collusion narrative story regarding Trump, and the media just will not let it go, despite the fact that the Mueller report was a non-event, but yet they still insist on pushing this whole Russian collusion. For all of the talk about Russia right now, I'm sure that probably our media is talking about the wrong things.
Well, they usually are. There are no Russia specialists in any of the major newspapers. These guys aren't historians. They don't know the culture, the society there at all. There may be a handful. Newspapers can't afford seasoned foreign correspondents anymore. Their readership is way down. So you never know what you're getting, which is why the alternative press, which is what we do, is so important. And specialists like me are so important. Russia is a threat to the U.S. because it is a Christian nationalist government that has no debt, has rebuilt itself almost overnight from dissolution in 1997, where people were talking about Russians just disappearing, if you remember back then. Lifespan of the average Russian male was 55. And now, under Putin, you have Russia now apparently controlling the planet. That's one heck of a recovery. And how did he do it? He's an extremely popular man. He has thrown the IMF out of his country. He could outmaneuver the West at every step of the way. Now, the collusion story, when this first hit, I just laughed it off because no one could tell me what the actual story was. Did these hackers from Moscow get into the American voting system and start changing vote tallies? Well, that was never the claim. At no time that was ever the claim. The closest I ever got was the NSA report right after the election said that media companies like RT, people like me, bloggers, all kinds of people like that, were unfairly influencing Americans, and that we're all Russian bots. And Russia, that's what they mean by they don't mean a hacker in the sense that you kind of break into a computer mainframe or something like that. That's not what they mean. That's not what the NSA said in their initial report. So if you ask any of these talking heads, what exactly do you mean by collusion? You're not going to get an intelligent response. I don't know if you ever heard Putin's responses to these things. His sarcasm is, but think of it like this. You have a regime that controls the world's universities, the newspapers, trillions of dollars in wealth, the world's militaries, at least, in the West, power that we could never imagine, power that we can't even dream of. And this is what they come up with? This is their big story to use against Trump? It doesn't suggest to me that this is a very healthy or secure ruling class. The closest I ever came to getting any kind of an answer as to what Russian collusion means was when Hillary Clinton got in trouble in the primaries. That's where this came from, not the general election. When she was funneling donations to the DNC to herself, which of course is illegal, pushing Bernie out of the running, that her campaign blamed Russian bots for this. They gave no evidence. It was just almost a throwaway line, almost sarcastic, that became this national meme. That's what it started as, and that's where it was. Now you have stories about them stealing the election, which again the claim was never that they broke into any computer in the general election and changed the vote tally of Florida or Louisiana or something. That was never the claim at no time. Because if you remember, the word hacking was used a lot in the beginning. Now they've switched that to collusion, and the assumption is that most Americans are just going to read the headline. They're not going to read the article. They don't have time to get into the detail of these kind of things. So again, they could say what they please. And facts don't matter. It's the general impression that they give to the population that Trump is not a legitimate president, that anyone who opposes Hillary Clinton could not by definition be legitimate. And of course, she's covering up a huge amount. If you went to foreign polls, I made a big deal about this at the time, polls from Russia, the Russian language, of American voters. I've seen one from Indonesia, one from Egypt, foreign polls of American voters. Hillary's polling like 10%, 15%. And this is verified by the likes that they got on Facebook, the Twitter feed. Trump blew her away. How the heck did she get half the vote? That can't be. Remember her rallies that had like 10 people in them? And he's selling out stadiums? How did she get half the vote? So this story really had a lot to do with protecting Hillary against Bernie, because the Democratic Party was excited about Bernie. I don't like Bernie Sanders. I respect Bernie Sanders, but I don't agree with him. I don't respect Hillary Clinton at all, or Joe Biden. I don't like them or respect them. You could respect someone without liking them. It was to protect Hillary from the claims of Bernie Sanders that she actually did manipulate the election, the primary election, and insider party stuff. And that's where this came from.
So you say that you respect Bernie Sanders. On what grounds do you respect Bernie?
Well, you understand, respect doesn't mean that you agree with him.
Oh, I understand that, but I'm just curious what your basis of respect is. I mean, he's done something to have earned that respect.
The man can debate you head to head and be a pleasant, nice guy about it. Hillary can't. Right. She simply doesn't have the knowledge. Hillary pretending to be a senator from New York, a state she has no connection to. Bernie doesn't have the sleazy background that Hillary does. He's wrong in a lot of things, but when he's right, he's right. And, so he has, so that's what I mean. It's just, certain people like Bill Clinton, I never respected him. He was too sleazy for that. I respect Karl Marx. Obviously the man was incredibly gifted. He was destructive and dead wrong, but it doesn't mean, respect is not like or agreement. It just means that this man is of great importance. Hillary Clinton is just too sleazy for this. I remember the trail of bodies that family left in the 1990s. I remember following it before the internet came out almost every day. I was in grad school at the time. And the press is absolutely obsessed with defending her. She's changed her opinion on almost everything over the years. She was against gay marriage not too long ago. You respect someone because they're intelligent, they stick to their guns, that they can debate you as a man. That's really what I mean here. But Hillary, and so what I'm trying to say is that the Democratic Party liked that about Bernie. And Hillary couldn't have that. And she did whatever she could to get rid of him. And that's where the Russia collusion story comes from.
Well, you talk about Russian interference in the American election. I say that. I mean, the media is the one talking about the Russian interference in the American election. But you had told me off air that the Americans were meddling in the Russian elections, probably even far worse.
Americans meddle in every election. The entire Russian opposition is financed by the CIA. They have no internal support whatsoever. The U.S. financed the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in Kiev in 2014. Now, that's interference. Where you have John McCain at the embassy passing out coffee to rioters. That's interference, all right. USAID, not to mention private NGOs, have created the opposition in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Russia. That's where they come from. They have no internal support because of what happened in those countries when that kind of crazy capitalism was imposed on them in the 90s. They have no love or respect for anything that comes from the West because of that. And so they needed to invent this opposition. These guys together maybe can poll 15%. Maybe. So Yeltsin in 96 was, he must have been between 5 and 10% approval rating. Yet the guy's reelected. Well, the cover of Time magazine actually says, I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, but the cover of Time magazine says U.S. saved Yeltsin's presidency. So this happens everywhere. The U.S. does this everywhere. It's the imperial hubris of the empire. Standards that the American empire can follow or shouldn't be followed anywhere else. We have this right based on someone's anointing that we can do this. And so pointing out double standards isn't going to help. They know that it's a double standard. So, the U.S. controls the Russian opposition. So this is, interference. I mean, it's far beyond interference. And to a great extent, there is a certain amount of projection and deflection going on. And I've mentioned this before. It's hard to prove. There's a lot of American politicians that would literally kill to be as popular as Putin is. And they could never match him. Not his image, not his success, not his strength. Not the fact that he's more powerful than the billionaires and doesn't need their money. They would love that kind of freedom. And this is one of the reasons they hate him so much. And they have a tendency to deflect their own weaknesses and dump it onto him. But unfortunately, that can have deadly results, as is the case in Ukraine in 2014.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about
What exactly is the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia? Because I think a lot of Americans probably, in the typical American mind, it's probably all just mushed together. So what is the actual relationship between the Ukraine and the Russians?
Well, I can't answer that here. That's, I have a book out on the topic. I have about 100 papers out on the topic in every kind of various way you can imagine. The simplest way to put it is that it was the not only the agricultural hub of the Soviet Union, one of the industrial centers of the Soviet Union. The electronics industry was based there. It's the most educated population on the planet. Per capita, number of people per capita with advanced degrees is highest in the world in Ukraine, even though now it's a fourth world country that the World Bank puts on the same level as Ghana and Ethiopia in terms of the economy. That's what American interference does to these countries. The Ukrainian economy, because it was a part of this Soviet empire, was geared as a piece of the Soviet empire, not to function by itself. For it to declare independence in 91 and then pretend that it could be sovereign, even though every aspect of its existence was geared to this all-union form of production, it was absurd. They don't have anything that the West wants. The West doesn't want what it makes itself, let alone stuff that's coming from Ukraine. Ukraine is the size of France. It's a huge part of Europe. It is absolutely essential to Russian history, always as an independent country, though. I mean, generally speaking, Ukraine was not under Russian control until the 20th century. That doesn't mean that they don't have a common lineage. They don't have a common brotherhood like the Belarusians do. But to take a piece of a much larger economy and to make it independent, and worse, make it serve a completely alien people who want nothing to do with it, economically speaking. This explains the absolute retardation of that once very, very advanced economy. I do want to say that the divisions between the East and West are overdrawn. To this day, Russians have a good reputation in Western Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalist opinion in Eastern Ukraine exists as well. That can be very much overdrawn. People like simplistic distinctions, that everything is a lot more complicated than that. But no Ukrainian of any intelligence is going to believe that the West, that is to say, the liberal West, EU, etc., has any solutions for them. It's the cause of why they're a fourth world. And what happened in 2014 absolutely broke my heart, because it destroyed the potential of this highly advanced country. And as far as I could see, Ukraine to the west is a source of cheap but educated labor, very attractive women. They're the most beautiful women in the world. I'm telling you right now, there's something about it down there. And, sex slaves. That's pretty much it. That's what the Ukraine has to offer. On the other hand, to the east, the Customs Union, the Eurasian Union, they could be an integral and very, very important part. But that's how the economy it was developed under the Soviets. Horrific in terms of human rights and everything else. But that's unfortunately how it is. It's something like forcing someone to take a blood transfusion of a blood type that doesn't mess with his. I mean, that's how bad it was. And that explains the absolute destruction. There is no functional economy in Ukraine right now. There is no functional currency. It has no value. Everything is propped up by the United States. The Ukrainian government is at the American embassy, and that's been the case for a very long time. And I have many, many policymakers over there saying that that's the case. I'm not saying that Ukraine should be absorbed into Russia, but they do have a common lineage, and they have a common destiny, they have a common religion, they have a common language. I mean, I could read both languages. There's, maybe about 75% overlap, but they're mutually, comprehensible. What happened in 2014 was a horrible event that was forced by the United States onto a country that simply didn't want it. And it caused a civil war with the two eastern republics, which are still independent today. They actually won because the Ukrainian army deserted and fell to pieces. Because again, what are they fighting for? Who are they fighting for? It's a heartbreaking thing to see an advanced country turned into Nigeria, which is essentially what it is today. And it's a shame, but that's how it is.
Well, I know that the Ukrainian ambassador is supposedly trying to get the attention of the U.S. Justice Department right now, as I understand it, because he wants to talk about Joe Biden's meddling in their recent election.
Well, Joe Biden's son was, I don't know if he still is, but he was on the board of a major natural gas company. Biden, as vice president, was putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian government to cut off any ethics investigation. Of course, it was a disastrous. Everything, all these big companies in Ukraine were they paid taxes when they felt like it. And of course, they said, the Russians were very clear. You're doing this because you're protecting your son here, not to mention, American interests. This has nothing to do with justice or anything else. So yes, he was putting a lot of pressure on them to avoid going after. I can't think of the name of the company off the top of my head. I believe it was natural gas, because his son sat on the board of directors, and he was protecting him. So in other words, he was protecting oligarchy, he was protecting the corruption, and of course, you'll find Americans all over the boardrooms of the big, Western-owned, Western-controlled companies in that country right now. So
do you think that with all of the hammering of Trump with Russian collusion and Russian relationships, do you think that that's going to backfire and that's going to have collateral fallout on the Biden campaign?
I think I would be. I mean, nothing really shocks me anymore, but I guess I would say that I would be shocked if Joe Biden continues any campaign for president. I know of so much, the money from the Albanian drug mafia that he has received over the years. There's so much stuff, not to mention his own very creepy way. We talked about the difference between liking and agreeing with someone and respecting somebody. At this point, anybody who believes this Russia collusion is you can't respect them, because they don't even know what that is. All they know is that the orange man is bad and we hate him. And so this is something we could use to beat him up with. This is just the lowest dregs of American image picture thinking. And that's really all it is. It's the most anti-intellectual thing imaginable. And again, Johnson's law is here. No one knows anything about Russia, really. And so they could invent whatever they want. And if you only read the headline, which most people do, that's the impression that the average person gets. I don't think Americans care about this. I don't think they understand it. I don't think they even know what it is. And given the fact that the economy has been in depression for a very long time, this issue isn't exactly high on the list. But like you say, for years now, they've been obsessed with it, ramming it down everyone's throat, even at the expense of listeners and viewers. And they have to balance this, selling newspapers or getting readers, getting viewers on the one hand, with supporting the liberal agenda, which of course is one of the big reasons they exist, on the other. And they have to balance that out back and forth. And if Biden's going to make that central to his campaign, then he's just a generally ignorant man. And I can't picture him, Americans will pretty much believe anything and do anything. But boy, if that's all the Democrats have, then they're worse off than I thought.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. So what is the real reason why Russia has to be villainized?
Well, I've touched on it already. It offers an alternative to liberal capitalism. I mean, what Putin did, he did outside of all Western categories. He did it without liberal ideology. He did it without Western banks. He did it with really as much native custom as he could muster, and rebuilt a country that was, third world in 1997, first world in 2004. Very few people can claim to have done that in such a fast period of time.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. If my memory serves, and it could be very flawed, and I know yours is not, was it around 1998 that Russia repudiated its debt?
They essentially went insolvent in 1997.
Okay.
And which was humiliation, of course. Not unexpected, but it was humiliation. Putin paid off his long-term debt early. They wouldn't let him. In fact, I have a paper on this. Back in 2003 or 4, I think it was, that they didn't want him to pay the debt early. They keep the bond rating at BBB negative, even though the country has no debt. The country has a strong economy, a strong currency, a very, very diverse industrial base, ties with all the big markets, a leadership that people have confidence in, the most draconian anti-corruption laws in the world. And they won't budge the BBB rating, showing that these Standard & Poor's and Moody's and all these credit rating agencies are phony. They simply are part of the agenda. Having Russia's rating at BBB negative, I think that's changed recently, but not much. Just shows you can't trust any of these people. Corruption is extremely intense. So they went from repudiating, just collapsing, going into receivership in 1997, for the worst year for Russia, to just a few years later paying everything off early, and then throwing the IMF out because, we don't need you anymore. And that's when really the condemnation began. That's when the attacks began. The dictatorship, and he's a multi-trillionaire and all this other stuff. But the other thing, of course, is that Russia has resources that a collapsing Western economy needs to function. These resources can offer an alternative to the American empire. And this is really the deeper issue. The U.S. never had a problem with Marxism, never had a problem with socialism, never had a problem with the Soviet Union. Never. They traded and aided the USSR from the day it was founded to the day it ended. They didn't like the empire, though. And when it got too big, people got antsy. Because the fear was if they can get the Chinese and the Indians, they could cut the U.S. out. The ideology was irrelevant. It didn't matter what they believed. Most people in Washington couldn't tell you what Leninism is if their life depended on it. But the fact that they were strong enough and had the resources at their disposal to one day cut the Americans out of any kind of trade deals or economic development, like is going on right now, has been the ultimate nightmare of these people. And the Silk Road Initiative, which is a complete rebuilding of the Asian economy, the creating of this gigantic market, really under Russia-Chinese leadership, institutionalized in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is one of the most important organizations in the world. This is why most people have never heard of it. The good guys in this, I think, are doing it without the dollar, without the Americans. But remember, if the dollar collapses, so does liberalism, so does empire, so does globalization. They're all connected. And that's why they're the good guys, ultimately. The regime, as it stands now, this private-public ruling class, the oligarchs in the West, they're hanging by a thread financially, which is why they're rounding people up here at home, which is why they're threatening war every 5 minutes in a war they could never win. They're being driven out of Afghanistan, and they're picking a war with China. This is what happens when you corner an animal, a wounded animal, and you don't let it leave. It's going to lash out. It's going to be irrational. It's going to do things that you wouldn't expect. And unfortunately, it's going to get worse here Just like in 1941, war may be the only way out for a ruling class that simply has no more ideas. I hope I'm wrong on that.
Well, I hope you are too, and there's just so much going on, and I'm glad you could put it into some kind of a perspective, because I haven't studied Russia like you have. So all I have to do is turn on the news, and I know that what I'm being told isn't reality. Trying to make sense of the misinformation and find the reality is just alluding to a lot of people. And
well, it should be, because it's not easy. That's why I went to grad school. Mm-hmm. I was a musician, and then the wall came down in '89, and I went, oh my God, I'm doing this now. And I realized that I became a theoretician because I knew I needed to explain the whole regime in a relatively simple way that, educated people can understand. And, oh, by the way, I didn't mention my website, if you wouldn't mind putting it whenever you post this.
Okay.
I'm so bad at self-promotion. I don't even mention it. I am the worst self-promoter out there, I tell you. But that's what I do. I mean, I'm creating a theory, a master theory that brings it all together. That's why Alexander Dugin was so important to me, because that's what he does. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of work to master all the various points of view and the language and everything else to make sense out of it all. And it all does fit together very nicely. Liberal capitalism versus nationalism is the divide. It's been the divide for many centuries now. That's the issue.
Breaker one might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time of good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
And that was pretty much the end of our conversation with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. We did have a kind of a personal, somewhat off-air conversation about baseball ejections that we had between the two of us from what we were talking about, and so I'll just let that remain a personal conversation between Dr. Johnson and myself. But I had no idea that Dr. Johnson was as avid of a baseball fan as I am. And so it was good to hear that, and it was good to have that conversation with him, kind of one more thing with which we can develop our friendship. But I would like to thank him for being presents the DIXIE Heritage Hour, and I would also like to thank you for being our guest. I do hope that you'll take the time to visit Dr. Johnson's website, which is the www.Russ Journal website. Or just type in Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson into Google or Bing, and his websites and his podcasts and other things will come up, and you'll be able to find out about his books and about his podcast and about the work that he's doing. I really do believe that Dr. Johnson is probably one of the foremost experts here in the United States on Russian history, Russian culture, and so forth. And so I know that you'll want to go to the Barnes Review website, www.barnesreview.org, and you'll want to check out Dr. Johnson's new book on the Soviet Union. Again, another great resource there that we're happy to make available to our listeners. I'd also like to encourage you to visit my website, www.dixiheritage.net, and sign up for our newsletter, the weekly DIXIE Heritage newsletter. It's sent absolutely free of charge every Friday, and it'll be jam-packed full of information that you'll want to read each and every week. When you sign up for the free newsletter, we will also send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. You can also read back issues of the DIXIE Heritage letter there on the website. We've got links to some videos, little bookstore you can shop in, some other things there as well. So be sure to check out www.dixiheritage.net. Next week, we have a very special treat for you. I'll be interviewing another of our DIXIE Heritage newsletter subscribers. And she is actually the girlfriend of one of the Leavenworth 10. And so we'll be talking about that in next week's DIXIE Heritage broadcast. But until then, I want to thank you for being our listener, and hope that you'll tune in again next week, same time, same place. We do have just a few minutes left here at the close of the broadcast, so I'm going to leave you with a rare recording. It is the old Soviet national anthem being sung in English, "Long live our Soviet motherland." Hey, it's no Star Spangled Banner. It's not even Canada, our Canada. It's not even God Save the Queen. But how often do you hear the old Soviet national anthem sung in English? So for those of you who want to stay tuned, here goes. See you next week.
United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. Through days dark and stormy, while great Lenin led us, our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above, and Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build the land that we love. Fought for the future, destroyed the invader, and brought to our homeland the laurels of fame. Her glory will live in the memory of nations, and all generations will honor her name. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. Motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united